this week's lesson where we're going to be talking a little bit about food forests. Food forests are also known as forest gardening systems. They are something that is used very regularly in permaculture design. And the reason being is that you can produce a lot of food in a small area that all ripens at different times of the year. Most of what is found in a food forest is typically perennial, meaning you plant it once and it comes back year after year after year, as opposed to an annual garden. The gardens that people typically plant with your tomatoes, your cucumbers, things like that. This is something that we set up once and it looks like a forest, it acts like a forest. It is very resilient, the same way that a forest would be. And it's also really pretty. Just makes a really nice addition to the, kind of maybe the perimeter of your backyard or a section of your farmyard or something like that. So today I'm just going to go over really basic ways to set up a bit of a little mini food forest in your own yard. So we'll first look at what constitutes a food forest and kind of how it's put together. So this particular graphic that I have here is from Temperate Climate Permaculture, so tcpermaculture.com. And it really is a beautiful graphic. I've got this included in the course notes just below the video here. And this particular example here really demonstrates the 9 different layers of an edible forest garden or a food forest. So typically we start off with something like a canopy tree. So the canopy trees are going to be the tallest trees in our entire system, in our whole food forest. And examples of something you might use in a food forest in Saskatchewan for the canopy layer might be apples, pears, plums, apricots, mountain ash, oak trees for the acorns, pretty much any sort of larger fruit bearing tree is more or less what you'd be using for the canopy layer for the most part. The next layer down, as we're going into our food forest, is the subcanopy layer or the large shrub layer. So this layer is where we really have quite a few options. I combine this with the shrub layer itself. He has it distinguished as kind of a large shrub layer and then a shrub layer, but for me I just kind of call that whole next layer a shrub layer. So shrubs being anything that still has a woody stem, bark, but is just smaller than a tree and kind of branches out a bit more than a tree would. So in our climate, that is typically most of our berry bushes. So we can grow things like raspberries and sea buckthorn and goji berries and saskatoons and choke cherries and gooseberries and sour cherries, and I'm sure I'm missing quite a few, black currants, basically things like that. So that will be our shrub layer of our food forest. The next layer that we look at is typically the herbaceous layer. So the herbaceous layer is going to be a little bit lower to the ground. He's got it listed as number 4 here because he combined these 2 shrub layers together. But the number 4 layer here of the herb layer is essentially, some of these herbs can be quite tall or quite large, but they differentiate themselves from the shrub layer in the sense that they don't have a woody stem. So these plants can either be edible, so things like rhubarb or chives or mint, or pretty much any of your medicinal herbs, so things like echinacea. We have a lot of different varieties of things we can use for that herb layer as well, but sometimes they just solely act as support species as well. So we might have something like comfrey, which would be a dynamic accumulator, meaning that its roots go very, very deep into the ground and mine minerals that they bring up into their leaves so that when they decompose, they act as fertilizer for other plants. So comfrey is a good example of that. Sometimes it'll be very aromatic herbs to basically keep pests away from our fruit trees. So things like chives next to your apple trees, or different plants like that that are really smelly and fragrant, will very often keep pests away from your larger canopy fruit trees. The next layer we look at is a ground cover layer. So that layer does just what it sounds like. It wants to cover the ground. So if we were looking at things in our food forest that are edible, it could be creeping Charlie. It could be, I guess mint kind of counts as a ground cover. It can be creeping thyme. It could be strawberry plants. Just something basic like that. And essentially in between those ground cover plants, we would have a layer of mulch basically covering the entire forest floor, and that ground cover just kind of spreads and takes over top of the mulch over time. So we never have bare soil with our food forest, just like we don't have bare soil anywhere else that we set up our systems either. And then after we have the ground cover layer, we're going deeper into the ground where we end up with a root layer. And the root layer is sometimes just the roots of the plants that we see above the ground, and sometimes the root itself is harvestable. So one plant that kind of fits the herbaceous category and the root layer would be daylilies, because you can eat the tubers and you can eat the leaves and the flowers of that plant as well. Another example of an underground root layer type plant might be horseradish, because that's something that's perennial that will come back year after year, and you can harvest the roots. Then sometimes you might even have a vertical climbing layer. So if we're thinking climbing layers, we're usually thinking of vines. This can be hardy kiwis, this can be grapes, it can be hops. So we've got, again, quite a few different options of perennials that we can grow in our climate. Sometimes you can have an aquatic or a wetland layer. Depending on where you're situating your food forest, you might end up with a little bit of a moisture area where you can grow some water-loving plants, things like cattails, and I'm sure there's other options too that I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but you can incorporate in a wet area as well. You just have to make sure that the roots of the rest of your forest aren't getting too saturated, because a lot of plants don't like having wet feet. And the last layer is going to be the fungal layer. And the fungal layer, luckily for us, is not something we usually have to plant. It's something that's just going to show up over time, because it really just shows up as things start decomposing, and as plant matter starts decomposing, you'll just happen to find mushrooms and things like that starting to grow. If you wanted particular mushrooms to harvest that are more specific, you can of course incorporate those in as well. So designing these particular food forests doesn't have to be all that complicated. We just want to think in terms of those layers and diversity and what we like to eat for the most part. So I'm going to do just a really quick example of how this might look in your yard. Let's just say that you live in the city and this is your backyard. Maybe your house is situated here. It's probably a lot more square than that. There we go. So there's your house, and then here's your backyard. And your backyard might not be that large. Maybe it's, let's see, maybe 40 feet wide by, okay, 40 feet. It looks like a square to me. So about 40 feet by 40 feet, you know, we're not talking a really, really large yard or anything like that. Most people will probably have a deck or something like that coming off of their house. You might have a little bit of, let's say, a shed in one corner. So we won't really plant anything there. Maybe you have an annual garden plot. And now you'd like to incorporate a food forest because the rest of this is all just lawn, for example. So the way that we would typically do this, and I apologize for not having a green marker, but turns out all of them had died on me today. So we're gonna have some purple trees going in here in the yard. And the idea is to place your canopy trees first, and then place your shrub layers, and then place your herb layers, and work your way down throughout the system in order to kind of fit them into your property. So let's say that we want an apple tree, and so this would be, I'm going to call it a multi-grafted apple tree, because apple trees need 2 varieties to be able to cross-pollinate and set fruit, but very often you can find a dwarf variety that has multiple grafts and different types of apples on one tree stalk. So you can get away with just getting one tree as long as it has multiple grafts on it. And then maybe you wanted a couple pear trees. And I'm doing a couple pear trees because again, the pears, the plums, the apples, and the apricots, they all require 2 trees to make fruit. So these would be considered dwarf varieties. They might not get much bigger than maybe 10 feet each in diameter and in height. They're really nice for urban lots because they fit well in the urban lot. And then we would work our way down to a shrub layer. So around each canopy tree, I typically do things in odd numbers. I don't know why, I just think it looks kind of nice. It's personal preference. You can do whatever you'd like and whatever the space will allow. But typically what I would do is put maybe 3 kind of shrubs around each canopy tree. So these shrubs might potentially be the gooseberries, I don't usually put raspberries in just because they sucker really badly. So I kind of do things that are more well-behaved. So things like haskaps or gooseberries or currants, anything like that. So you can kind of put in a couple of those shrubs surrounding each canopy tree. And then I kind of fill in with some of the herbs. So let's say we had some chives and some comfrey kind of surrounding each tree. And again, it can kind of just be artistic. We're not looking for anything in particular. When you are looking at where the sun comes into the yard, that's a whole other topic. So we'll go through that in a different lesson. So for right now, I'm not really looking at sun angles, which I do 100% of the time. But for this example, I'm just trying to, get the point across as to the food forest itself. So you would toss in a couple herbs. And then you can go ahead and at this point, usually is when I would mulch really, really heavily around all of these plants once they're put in. You could put your root plants in too if you wanted to first. But I basically would mulch all the way around this, usually with wood chips, something like that. And when I say mulch, I usually mulch with like a foot of mulch, like tons and tons of mulch, so that no weeds can come through. There's lots of moisture suppression and retention, and things like that. And so I put a bunch of mulch down, and then I would take whatever's gonna be my ground cover. So let's say that the strawberry plants were the ground cover, and all I would do is just take that mulch and move it aside and put a little strawberry plant in, and then I'd move the mulch aside somewhere else and put another strawberry plant in, and then over time they're going to grow and spread and propagate and things like that as ground cover. And then of course if you want to put any vine layers or anything like that in too, you can do that as well. But for the most part, if you just kind of focus on the canopy trees, the shrubs, the herbs, and then getting a good ground cover in, that's pretty much the best starting point.